You would think.
Since you would say lots.
Yeah, seriously. Did you guys watch the game?
I watched most of it.
I watched part of the.
I
didn't watch
too much at work.
Oh man.
But like everybody was like USA's gonna win, and I look at like when people were betting, everybody was betting USA.
No.
Yeah.
Really?
Belgium
Oh,
was
wow.
dominated that game.
Yeah, it was like all defense.
It was at the majority.
But man,
It
did you
was
see
like
that end?
60%. So I was like, Belgium's gonna win. They're like, why? I'm on. Bookies always win. Vegas always win. If it's like an even, like half and half bet, then it's like
You never know.
You never know. But if it's majority of one side, they usually lose.
But did you see how many, like, they did have some really good chances.
Well, Howard
Yeah, that
was,
right before the end of the game.
Oh.
I was like, forget it, I'm not watching this anymore.
Howard
That was really crazy.
he did his job, but I was just like,
They should have ended it right there.
I know, seriously.
well, USA shouldn't have technically advanced. So
No, they earned it. It's just, well, there's some elements.
they didn't earn it. They got lucky because it didn't like they earned it because they only advanced because Ghana lost. So it wasn't like they
Internet's a little bit faster than it was last week, but not by much. Maybe 4 megabits upload.
But yeah, dude, I went to sauce that much. Try to go.
Yes, if one.
So what blows out, it's meant to shred and then go.
doing even at a very, very young age. Because we tend to excuse it. Like, we want to give excuses for them. We don't want to see sin and call it sin. We want to call it cute behavior, that is sassy. Or we like using words that describe sin without actually using the word sin. Like I said, sassy, or it's another word. I don't know if any of you can think of it. Independence, yeah. Free will, free thinker, free spirit, strong will, fiery, yeah. And the challenge is we have this fear that we're going to squelch personality by clamping down, and that's the idea, is that we think of it as clamping down. We're going to drop the hammer on you, pound you, and that's not what we're talking about here. But what we are talking about is giving the child the tools that they need to experience the freedom that they ultimately can have if they understand how what they do have, if they really grasp that. I'll describe what that is, but
I did have a question about
yeah,
that.
can you do me a favor and mute that, Julia?
Oh, mute it?
Oh, mute I could hear myself.
Oh, sorry.
The speaker, I could hear the speaker.
Oh, sorry.
Yes.
I had a question about that because, he had mentioned something about not giving your kids choices in order for them to understand authority.
You mean a vote?
Yeah, a vote.
A vote.
And that's something I struggle with because I see kids that have too many choices and they do feel like they do rule the world. And then the fear of not giving them choices is that they form into people that are indecisive.
Mm-hmm.
They don't know how to make a decision because they've never been given a decision.
Right. Yeah, it's very, here's the thing about God himself. Everything is, not everything, but many things are counterintuitive. And I think the reason that is that we operate from a self-centered rather than a God-centered worldview by nature. As Ellen was saying earlier, that we operate from almost from birth, this sense of, I'm going to rule my world. And so sometimes the thinking is that the more I pursue living under authority with a right view of having good choices laid out before me, that will sort of hinder my ability to think or my creativity or all those things. But what I find is that the people who are most secure about their identity in Christ and are oftentimes the most free in their expression and in their abilities. And the example that I want to give regarding that is, think about studying, right? I mean, in many ways, education is bondage. Because for almost, how many years? If you go to college and then grad school, you're talking about 16 years of your life is, actually that's with just undergrad. Grad school, almost 22 years of your life, 24, 25 years, whatever, is covered with studying, tests, exams, and papers, right? Mm-hmm. And I know when I was in college, there were two types of students. There was I'm going to really focus and discipline myself and do the work and study hard and all this. And then there was why do I need to study? I want to do whatever I want. College, I'm finally free. I have money to spend. It's called a student loan. Bad choice, but, and I want to do. And where I went to school, it was about an hour away from Atlantic City. And a lot of people would go to Atlantic City. It would be like, going to UNLV. I mean, it would be, imagine how difficult it would be. And so there were two types of students, right? One claimed freedom because they could do whatever they want. But what happens to that freedom? Is that true freedom? You could do whatever you want, but so many of those students today, they're jobless. They're actually in bondage to now their circumstances for the rest of their life. Those people who studied hard, they have a lot more freedom in their life to actually be able to pursue the very things that they wanted. And what I find is that that's the case with, I've seen it even play out in my own family with my own children. I'm sure, Ellen, you feel the same thing, is that the more I'm always battling this fear of, if I lead my children and direct them and discipline them and do all that I can at the very young ages, that's going to stifle their personality, their creativity, their growth. But what I have found is that the more that they were able to establish that at the younger ages, by the time they hit 10, 12, there's a lot more freedom for them to do what they want to do. I mean, we really do let them go a little bit more. We find far less disciplinary challenges. It's not that we don't still have them, we do. And we still have battles. But I tell you that the many battles that we fought early on to help them to understand authority, eventually as they get older, amazingly you find that they want to follow the wisdom that you have. They trust that. And you start then slowly releasing some of the, whereas a lot of parents, they do it in the opposite way. What they do is they release their kids very early on to do whatever they want. You know, all kids need to learn and have free expression, do whatever they want. So they're going around hitting adults and say please or thank you or do anything. And the parents, you know, they go to someone's house and the kids are going crazy, you know, in the house, and they don't say anything. You know, the parents don't say anything, right? And they say, oh, kids are kids. But you know what happens as they get older? Guess what happens? It's worse. Well, how do the parents parent them?
Try to lock them up.
They try to clamp down then. The interesting thing is that it's inverted. So what I found is that those parents, and I'm not saying someone who is harsh, it's not about harshness. It's about a biblical, gracious, authoritative parenting where it's not about being angry, but it's about expressing the relegated authority that we have as someone under God, releasing that to our children. The more you are able to understand, that's why I need to do this and fight these battles as early as possible, because as they get older, their hearts change. And when their hearts change, they actually decide, oh, you know what, I actually want to follow. It's not a bad thing. I see your point. I mean, they get it. And you start releasing all the curfew, you know, the curfew gets longer, or you start trusting them more. But if it's the other way, you start putting in more rules and regulations. And then guess what happens with rules and regulations? When they're older. They do, right? I mean, that's what the teen years are like. And especially once they leave the home, then you really have nothing to say anymore. You're really just relying on them. Again, this is not a guarantee of anything, because ultimately it's the Lord who does it. But it is to say that we have this opportunity to really make an impact in the lives of our children, and it starts actually with where your kids are at. It really does. That's a long explanation, Julia. But I think that that's one that I've seen personally really play out. You know, when we went to Lori and Derek's place on Sunday. I hope I can use this as an example for myself, because you might be like, oh no, no. But I mean, whatever. Yeah. You go. Be totally honest, okay? Well, how do my kids behave?
You're really good.
I want you to be totally honest though. If they were not.
Yeah.
Did you see me saying a lot of things to them?
Just to one of them.
I heard you, call out one child's name.
His full name.
That's why.
Well, you know what? I have a 15-year-old, a 13-year-old, an 11-year-old, and a 9-year-old. And I was also having this conversation with Derek and Scott, who were there. We were talking about gender differences. When I had only 3 girls, I didn't understand all-boy families. I was like, are the parents really parenting? You start being judgmental. You really think, wait a second, what's going on? Until you have a son, and then you think, wow, what a different animal. You know, well, very different than a girl, because I had 3 girls, right? So, but I'm still in the parenting. I mean, not that we're not parenting all of them, but we're in that engaging parenting with still our youngest child because he's still relatively young, so we're working with him. But we have to prep him when we go over someone's house, and then we have to do it while we're there, and then we have to debrief after. Because those are times where you're trying to tell him, here's why you don't run all over people's furniture. Because you want to show them respect. You want to say that I'm thankful that you invited me over to your house, and therefore I want to treat your things with respect because I recognize you as the authority, as someone over this home. And so therefore I don't want to trample on that and totally think that I could do whatever I want because by nature he's autonomous, or I am. So it takes constant conversation, battles, sometimes discipline, but in the end, you see the payoff in the end. But it's hard. What are your thoughts? Any questions? Any questions online? Okay.
Well, I noticed with my kid, like if my friends and their kids come over, he's more like this is my he's like a dog, right? He's like claiming his territory.
Your son, or you mean your friends?
My
Your son's
son.
friends.
He's like that's my toy.
Yes.
But then if he's at someone else's house, he's more like, is it okay? Like he kind of.
Yes. Isn't that interesting?
And then we also know this past weekend we were talking about they were talking about authority levels, and since they're kind of like, I don't think they're, I don't think there's if there's other kids around the same age or not even the same age, they're smaller than it, they're bosses them around. But if there's a bigger kid, he's like, oh here.
Yes.
And he just it's just weird, he already knows even height matters at that time.
Right.
He's just little kid, that's my toy, I don't care.
Peter, how old is your son again?
14 months.
Well, when you think about what, sort of Paul Tripp's point is that children understand a lot. Yeah. And the things that they say or do, it shows you that they're processing everything in their world. They're creating a worldview. They're creating a way in which they comprehend the world. And kids who have autistic tendencies or on the spectrum, they have a hard time with that because they're not able to process how all things work together. Whereas generally most children are automatically generating a lot of decisions and thoughts about themselves. So and your son is clearly revealing and highlighting that.
Yeah.
But it's not just your son. They're all doing that. Yeah.
I'll just say it's interesting because I feel like deep down yes, I know that of course giving them more structure early on and everything's good. And I feel like it's funny because going to Berkeley and just being around I guess being in the Bay Area is very liberal, right? So I feel like I almost have a gut reaction to certain things where it's kind of start to think but how freedom, expression is so important, or just not looking at authority almost with not just submitting completely to authority, but you always kind of want to question authority. That's just kind of the the Bay Area, the liberal, and then it's so it is hard sometimes, because you almost want to play into that sometimes, where you don't want to come off too, stifling, so.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's something I think we're going to have to really wrestle with. And my hope is to show you that in the end, it's not about whether you submit to authority or not. In the end, what I want for myself is joy. And I've said that many times, is that I want joy. And to me, that's more than happiness. It's a deep contentment that runs far with peace and with joy and with happiness and with all those things. I want that for my children as well. And the question really that we need to get to is, what is the pathway to that end? And if it's questioning authority, then we should pursue that above all else. Because in the end, it's a masochist. It's someone who, if you only want terrible things to happen to you, then there might be a particular road for that, but no one wants that for themselves, really. Unless you're a nihilist, unless you believe. But generally speaking, most people want to be happy. So the questioning authority lead you to that place. So that's something we need to cover and think through. So we're going to go through that, and that's why I want to talk about it. But talking about a few things. The first thing is, so let's think about that authority in the first place. Is that here's why I would say that. Remember when we first started? One of the things that I said that was going to be a presupposition to our class is that the Bible is true. If I don't believe the Bible is true, then we're really going to have very different starting points, because now I have to prove that the Bible is true. And the only way that I can hold to anything that we're talking about is, for example, such as, here's why you should submit to this authority, parental authority. This is why you should do it. Because above parents is God. And so therefore, when we're trying to teach submission to authority, we're trying to teach when it's an ultimate submission to God's authority. That if you cannot submit to your parents' authority, you won't be able to submit to God's authority. That there's a direct line. And the reason why that's so essential is because of the Bible itself, that it reminds us that He's the one who's leading. And we're, as he was talking about, we are representatives of that authority. We represent God. But remember, authority on its own, without the goodness, is what? If there's no goodness behind the authority, what is it then? Yeah. Oh, should consider rebelling against, right? So that's what we should be suspicious of. Is so you have to assess, okay, I'm totally willing to submit to authority. I need it, because without it, there's only chaos. But I just want to submit to a good one. So that's what we really need to really think through. And we as Christians say, okay, the Bible tells us that there's an authority, and his name is God. He's the ultimate one. And we don't just follow him because he's all powerful. The amazing thing about God is not just that he's all powerful, but he's also perfectly good and loving and just and wise. So if I want to submit to that, we just don't have that in this world. There is no perfect king in this world. So if there was, that would be the best form of government. We just don't. So instead, you know what our government is based on? What is it based on? What's the foundational premise of the United States government?
Checks and balances.
Checks and balances. It's the idea that actually people are naturally sinful and are going to do wrong things. And so you need other institutes and branches of government to make sure that another one doesn't become a despot, doesn't become tyrannical. And so even our very own government assumes sin or the depravity, that you need other checks. And they're always checking each other, and it's still imperfect. The ultimate government is the perfect king government who is wise, good, and powerful, who can enforce the law, who is morally good so that they'll never abuse it, and will always be kind and compassionate and loving, but is always just and perfectly just. That we don't have. But we do have a God, and we lead under that premise. So that's sort of my answer there, Keith.
Oh, no, that's good.
Any thoughts there, any questions? But that's a really important one, because I know exactly what you feel, Derek. Did all of you feel that way a little bit? That feeling of authority. That word sounds bad, doesn't it? Authority. But it shouldn't. It only sounds bad because we have this presupposition about it, about what authority is.
So you know how he was saying that you don't want to have these battles with authority when your kid's 17, so you deal with it now. So in turn, does that mean if we deal with it now and figure it out, then we won't have to ever worry about it later when they're 17, 18?
See, remember when I was talking about that, and I said, ultimately it is the Lord. That I do think that in the end, even if you were to parent biblically and do all that you could, only God saves ultimately. This is only a means to an end, but it's not the end itself. And so that's why I wouldn't want to bring you down a road, Gloria, or any of you that makes you think that follow this to a T and your kid's gonna be awesome.
Recipe to success.
Yes, it's not. In the end, we still believe that salvation belongs to the Lord. But what it does do, I think what it does do is it brings our kids to the fountain. But they gotta drink it, and ultimately it's the Lord who really brings it. Because sometimes he has to push them in because they will not drink from that. They still think, no, I don't need it, I don't need it. But at the very least, we're bringing them, we're showing them why this is so good. And I do think that you'll see some real fruit from this. Because it just means you're trying to be gracious and loving them as much as you possibly can. Yeah. Here's a couple of things. The battles, if you take this approach, get ready to be tired. It doesn't end. It's not like you're tired already, and I know. Eddie, you're at a really tiring stage. That's a hard,
Well, I think the battle is not just with your kids, with everybody that's involved. It's the
Such as?
husband,
Yes.
it's the grandparents.
Yes.
And it's that battle of consistency.
Yes.
Yes. For them to observe authority in the right way.
Yes.
And that's hard because at a very young age, I don't think Arden was even 2. If I said no, he went to someone else. If you know what I mean, he ran the circle
Yes.
to find the yes that he wanted.
Yes.
And that only gets worse as they get older because they manipulate and work the system because they understand it all much more.
Julia, it doesn't stop at 3.
No,
I'm
it
telling you,
doesn't.
it doesn't. In fact, that very instance happened to me and Sua just 3 days ago. And one of my kids, I had said no to them about something, and they went to Sua. Yes. And she came and tried wise. And then so she and I had to have a heart-to-heart. And it took a while. We had to wrestle through some issues. And one of the challenges for her, I was saying, is you got to trust me on this. And I had to explain why and go through a lot. Eventually, she apologized to me. Sua did. And she realized that she didn't understand fully where I was coming from, why I said no, why I wanted this. I wish I could give you the example, but it's sadly it usually deals with my one child. but I would say though that they totally work the system. But that's why what he was talking about. They know what they're doing. They want autonomy. I will not listen to you. I will rule my world. They might not say those words, but that's what they mean, ultimately. And they could do it in a really cute way. They can be really cute sometimes.
Yeah, I see my son is on the verge of that because my in-laws are with us and they watch him during the day. And he kind of sees grandma as like his best friend. And they cater to him very well.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll just leave him in the corner and let him cry. Doesn't bother me, but yeah.
Well, that's what Julia was saying, is that there are different people in your children's world that can lead them in a different path than the way that we wanted to do. That's where one of the things that he was saying is, do not give authority. Do not give it away. Because, how do we give it away? What are some ways we give that authority away?
Concede to what they want.
Because they can pound you. Sometimes some of our kids, like especially if any one of us really strong-willed child.
Don't we all?
Well, you know what?
Who doesn't have?
But okay, because I have 4, you see degrees. Like if I only had 2, I'd be like, oh, okay, yeah, that's a strong. But then it's 4. No, that's the strong-willed child. You know what I mean? So sometimes you can really sense there's a real depth of, especially because you're saying over and over again something, and they're battling you over and over. They refuse to relinquish. They refuse to surrender. Do any of you have that child? Refuse to surrender? Yeah?
Yeah.
Yes? Yes. So that's hard.
Stella.
That's hard.
That's the second one.
Yeah.
I would say it's not the, don't ever, not don't ever, but one of the things that we're learning from our time together is there really is no such thing as only 2. Do you know what I mean? The challenge for us is that we can very much think, oh, how could they be like this at such a young age? But one thing we're learning is they're like this at a very young age because that's their heart. It's not the external circumstances that create it. They're like that from very early on.
And it's harder when they're younger because they're not reasonable. You can't talk to them about it.
Mm-hmm.
So, anger is much difficult.
Yes.
So
That's where next week will come into discipline, because that's why corporal discipline has its place. It has to be done in a wise, gracious, loving way. And I know you're all thinking, how does that happen? How can it be wise, gracious, loving, and it still be corporal discipline? I really believe that. I've seen it. It can happen. However, it takes a lot of hard work. But we'll talk. Like I said, I'm sorry.
Your one child. How early on did you see it?
Man.
Out of curiosity.
So you know what he was talking about? Food. Food was a real battle for us, for every one of our children. And there was one time where I remember. So the way I know why I'll call, Jack, probably my strongest child, Will child. Partly I wonder if that's because he's a boy, he's also last, so he has sort of like two things going, factors, right? But it could be just who he is. There's something unique about a strong willed child, which is that they tend to have, if they have a right view of God and a right view of authority, can be that they can use that for leadership. I mean, you really can see that. So sometimes the very things that you see sin in are the character traits that under a Godward perspective, that person can really thrive and grow in a way in which God will use them in a unique way. So as much as I say these things about my son, I also see if he could just have certain vision, worldview, and discipline, he can really take off, in a direction that can be used. So that's why I would say, for any of you who do have strong-willed children, it is not a curse to have a strong will. In fact, it can be totally used by God in mighty ways. But you just need to know, how am I going to parent this child through that so that they're not all over the place and they totally lose sight of everything and go off the rails, on that. But during eating times, that's when it was really so evident. I mean, throwing food or not wanting to eat ever of what we gave in front of him. It wasn't just him though. All of my kids had this problem, and I had to literally. I remember one meal I had to take him out, bring him to another room, and have a mixture of timeouts, talks, and corporal discipline, literally in one meal, 15 times. Bring him back, go nuts. Bring him back, take him out. And I tell you that in the midst of that, I sinned at least twice, if not more. And I had to apologize to him later on. The ongoing, it's not just him though, definitely Carissa also was like that as well, our first. And there had to be constancy and a refusal to believe that this will lead to no good result. It was the recognition that this is what God had given to me. I'm a flawed person, but I will trust His word and I'll continue and press on. And Sue and I need to be together on it too.
When you were talking about your children like that, or like just you say your son, because he's a guy or a boy, that he might be more strong-willed. Do you think maybe just being subconsciously thinking that because he's a boy, you want him to be strong-willed at the same time? And you kind of let it go away and kind of freedom to be that way? That's a good thought, but I'm not saying that it's necessarily that a boy is always strong-willed. I don't always think that's the case. I think that there are a lot of girls who are strong-willed too. And sometimes they express it in different ways. But I would say, though, that I don't know if I want to read that because it's so hard. I mean,
I know you don't. It was so hard.
You said you were saying your oldest and your son, right? And I'm thinking, just me thinking this, like, oh, it's your first child, so it's first daughter, and it's your first child. You're like, oh,
Yes.
I don't know what might be my only child, so I want her to be, strong woman who could stand up for herself, and not even like you just subconsciously like just teach her that, and those are the outcomes. I mean, I see it in myself, like with my son. I'm like, oh, if he falls, I'm like, let him fall,
Sure.
let him learn.
Yes.
Like, because he's a boy. But I know if I had a daughter, I'd be like, oh, a baby here.
Sure.
Like, I'm just thinking like.
I absolutely think that we rear our kids and we impact them in ways that we probably don't even realize we're doing. And I know that does happen. I'm sure I do that with my kids. I do think that there are some things that you can do to really try to offset that if you're intentional about it. Like, for example, with my youngest, so with Jack, we do all that we can to make sure that when there are chores to do or something like that he's never excused from doing it. No matter how small he was, he always had to do something too. Because that was always the concern for me, is that here's this youngest child who's also a boy amongst 3 girls. And when we were going out, when they were young, especially if we went to Asian restaurants, usually the waitress would say, oh, you're going to be really well taken care of. You have 3 daughters. And I got that all the time. And the scary part is that people would start saying that about Jack. Oh, he'll be so taken care of. He has 3 older sisters. And the scare, when you see that happening, where you almost think, okay, this guy can take a day off because his sisters will do everything for him. And they would. If we didn't intentionally say, no, you're not going to be excused from doing chores. You have to pull your equal share. And it's not legitimate for you to do that. And it's not, in fact, sometimes I would have them do more than even my daughters. Every once in a while, because they do a lot all the time. But if I didn't do that intentionally, if Sue and I didn't do that intentionally, he would absolutely take advantage of that. He would go play video games while all the girls are doing the dishes. Like, that's what would happen. But we tell him, no, you can unload the dishwasher. You have the ability to do that too. You can go get the fruit yourself. You don't need me to go and get that piece of fruit to eat it. You know how to do that. And so that might sound, I don't know if that sounds mean to you, but I think that it's so important for my youngest child to know that they're not going to be catered to by his sisters or the world, for that matter, right? I also want my son to know that if you have a son, I want him to know that one day I want him to be a protector and a provider. Doesn't mean that his wife can't work, but it means that if she decides I don't want to work, that I don't want my son to be like, well, no, you go get a job. I'm just gonna play video games all day, hang out at home, sleep in, wear my pajamas all day. No, I don't want that. I don't think it's biblical. I don't think it's something that. And so therefore, he needs to know what responsibility means. So all of this, you're thinking about this at a very young age, because the little things that you do impact the person, that child, and eventually what that person's outlook on life is going to be like. And that's pretty amazing when you think about the influence that we have over a life like that. The problem is we pull back and we don't take that. We just say, do whatever you want. That's problematic.
Question.
Yeah.
So you talked about how, during that eating session you disciplined your child 15 times. And he also, the speaker also talked about how you shouldn't allow your kid to almost get away with certain things or give away that authority, right? So so is that pretty much the route that is suggested, basically taking the time, spending the time to not let them get away with anything, like being too tired to just I'm tired, okay, just let them off the hook, because I know that for us it's a big struggle every time we have dinner or lunch or whatever. It's just a struggle, where they want to run away, get off from the table, and discipline. Finally, one of us will break or whatnot, and okay, it's enough. I just let it go. And then she's off and not eating.
So
Keep going.
like
Going
you
to
described.
Yeah. It's a submission.
I almost feel as though it's the opposite of force feeding. It's not force feeding, just don't give them the food. See, the problem is that, so when it comes to eating, and I told,
If you don't give them the food, that's what they're arguing. They don't want it. So
Right.
then you're giving
you
them
know,
that
I mean,
power.
when I was in Africa, so I've been to Africa, but I spent about 6 weeks there amongst the poorest of the poor. And I saw little babies to teenagers, right? And tons of orphans. The food that they were eating was slop. I mean, because they got one meal a day. It was a chicken head and chicken feet. That's it. Chicken head, chicken feet. That was their one meal of the day, and we helped them serve that. In fact, my kids helped them serve it. So definitely gave them my kids an appreciation for what not having food is like. So if you really want, that's a good picture. Take your family to Africa. But anyway, that's a whole nother story. But I'll tell you this though, there was not one child that refused that food. That said, I don't want to eat that. You know why? Because they were hungry. We just happen to have plenty. We have so much. So we're dealing with, we're talking about here. We're here. Those kids are here, right? And in our mind, we're thinking, oh, you know what? My kids cannot starve because they didn't, I gotta feed that meal because they're gonna starve to death. I've been with kids who've eaten one meal a day for all the days of their life, and it's that one meal. Trust me, they're starving to death. Your kids are not starving to death. And I tend to think that it's more about me than it is about my child, like what they can handle. I can't handle it. I can't handle seeing my child not eat a meal today and go to sleep hungry. I have found that it is hard, and I'm not saying that you're going to perfectly do this. But here's the amazing thing about this is that I do think that over time, if you're relatively consistent, you do the best that you can, eventually they'll get it. So it's not to say you're going to be perfect at it. You'll do all that you can, but have those battles where you need to. You are going to be tired. Sometimes you might not. Sometimes you refuse to feed them. Eventually they'll get to a place where they'll be hungry. They'll want to eat. They're not going to die of starvation, really. I've seen it firsthand. I know what people who die of starvation look like. Your children are not in that place.
So, okay, I mean, if my authority is telling them to eat, but they don't want to eat, but then you're saying to let them off and just say, okay, well, you don't want to eat then. Okay, don't eat. Then you're not, wait till you're hungry then.
Well,
I don't even give them anything. If they don't eat that meal, they don't get snacks, they don't get nothing.
yeah, no snacks.
Right.
If you give snacks, it totally defeats it.
Right.
I mean, that doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
It has to be about the meal. But here's what I would say is you're constantly explaining and talking.
Um,
Here's why we want you to eat this food. And let's say it's Brussels sprouts, right?
Right.
Let's just say it's something. And because there are definitely foods that Sue will give our kids that they don't like, they don't prefer it. In fact, one of my kids, and it's not that this time, Sarah, she is the most picky and finicky eater out of all my kids. She always says, I don't like that. She's very blunt too. I don't like it. Yeah, she says it like that too. But she used to say that a lot when she was young, and she would take over an hour to eat. But we made them sit there an hour, and sometimes we discipline them. Sometimes I'm not saying I have the corner on exactly how to deal with this, because I think there's a lot of different approaches, and there's no set standard. But I think the one thing I would say is don't let them control ultimately what they're going to eat and whether they're going to eat it or not. You might decide, okay, I'm not going to feed you, or you might say, I'm going to give physical discipline, or you might say, you're going to sit there and wait for an hour, or you're not going to have desserts, or whatever it might be, or you're going to have a timeout, or whatever the approach. But to leave that child to have the ultimate say is in a sense, one small way of them undermining that they need to listen to you. And I think Paul Tripp is right. It's not about food. It's about authority in the end. And it's always going to be sleeping. You know, your child's going to come out of bed, right? Or bath time, or whatever it might be. There's going to be something, some circumstance that's going to try to challenge you into thinking that, no, I'm going to control the situation. I want to do what I want to do. That's basically what your child is saying. I don't want to eat it. I can choose for myself what I want to do, and you can't make me. And so that's really a challenge to your authority as the one who, now I'm not saying get angry, but you have to be consistent and constant in your response. Hard to imagine, right? But I will say this, the battles are worth it. Fight these battles, even though you're dead tired sometimes. It's worth it. Like, when you pull all-nighter for, I don't know if any of you, maybe you're good students, you never pulled all-nighters in studying for school. But sometimes you have to study harder than usual. But that studying helped you to be where you are today. Without it, you would have flunked your classes. You wouldn't have the freedom to do what you want to do. So think of it that way. Sometimes you got to work really hard to distance yourself for the sake of it. What are your thoughts? Hard to imagine, right? That'll pay off.
No, I mean, I feel like it will. I'm just trying to think of the times that, if we let them go on different things, and like, when, we could have not let them go on certain things.
I definitely see it. Like with Arden, I was always really on top of him. With Stella, most days I feel so tired, and like I will have one eyes closed for her, because she does get away with a lot more, and I had to catch it because she really didn't understand authority after a while, and we really had to like redo that because that was not working, and it's not for her good.
Mm-hmm.
And I many conversations with Vic, like, hey, you can't let her get away with it just because she's cute, or just because like she manipulated you into like saying yes. I mean, it's
Just
like how it works system. And I have to say, like, I don't want her to grow up not understanding, like, demeaning authority. Like, it's really important. And like, they say all the time, kids need structure. It's good for them. And so, I don't think like instilling authority over children is like being mean or being, whatever. It's something you do out of love for them because it's necessary and it's for their good.
Yeah. You bring up an interesting point, Julia, is that what's interesting about having multiple children is that each parent responds to each child differently based on birth order, gender. In other words, the way that I approach my son is different than the way I approach each daughter that I have. And then Carissa might be treated different. She's my oldest, my firstborn, and then Sarah and Elizabeth and Jack, and whereas Sue responds to them differently, and she has a different relationship with each of them. Do you find that to be the case with your multiple children, that each parent has a different, and sometimes, I know we don't want to use the word favoritism, but sometimes without trying to, we can favor one, like I can favor one child, maybe Sue can favor another child. And it might come out in different ways. Maybe it's very subtle, but it's there. And so recognizing those things are important. I mean, it happened in the Bible. Isaac favored Esau. Rachel favored Jacob. And you saw terrible consequences of that. So definitely, do you see that playing out in your relationships? Sometimes that happens. It really can happen in a lot of different ways, and sometimes you don't realize it. Another thing to bring out when the kids are young is the way, if you have multiple siblings, if you have more than 2 children, you have 3 children or more, you need to be really aware of the relationship that they have with each other. And what I've always found is that when I look at adult children with multiple siblings, sometimes one, like maybe I might be closer to one sibling than the other, vice versa. And you'd be surprised as to how much of that has to do with parenting. Because, for example, when our kids were young, we have obviously 4 children. 2 stayed 2 naturally connected with one and 2 naturally connected with the other. Like Carissa and Jack and Elizabeth were younger, closer in age together, hung out together all the time. And then Sarah and Carissa hung out. And we used to have 3 bedrooms, so we're back to that again. But and Carissa and Sarah were in one bedroom, and Elizabeth and Jack were in the other. And these 2 sets would always be talking to each other and hang out with each other, but they had a very difficult time in any other context. And they tended to fight when they were in other pairs. And so we realized that we had to do something about that. And so what we did was we switched up the rooms.
Well,
And also, yeah.
Elizabeth and Sarah. Sarah says Elizabeth talks in her sleep.
Yes, for a while. And then driving, we have a minivan. So and we put 2, and then there's the 2 of us. And it'll always be the same pairs. So we told them, no, you're going to switch. You have to switch who you're sitting next to. And we're always aware that, okay, how they relate to each other. You're watching. So this part is more than if you just have 2 kids. Always look at the interaction of each other. And are they treating each other with respect? Is the older one caring for the younger one? But one thing to be careful of is to not always say, hey, you're older, you should be taking care of your younger, fill in the blank. Because that automatically creates a sense of treatment of a child should be like this because of age and age alone, and that's it. It should be, you should treat your sister with respect because that's what God says is the greatest path to your joy. I mean, that's what He wants you to have peace and to enjoy this relationship. It's not because you're older, and vice versa. You should treat your child. It's not to say that there's no place for age distinction, but it's that the ultimate cause and reason for something is our understanding of who we are before God. That determines everything. And actually, if you're really pursuing that, it's going to really make a great relation between a brother or sister, or a parent and child. Any questions or thoughts? Anything from online? They're really quiet.
Anne had said, yes, we have so much food here. I see how much the school kids throw away unopened milk, a good apple, etc. These kids don't understand the vast choices they have in America.
But I know, and I brought that up. But here's the problem with that, is that sometimes there's this thinking of where a parent will say, do you know how much kids are starving in Africa? You got to eat all your food. And again, I think when we make something external from us, and first of all, for the kids, that's totally abstract, right? They don't understand. For my kids, it's not abstract, actually. They literally were there. And so when I say that, they have pictures of with orphans. Each one of them has a picture, and each one of them has it on their desk, with them sitting there with a bunch of orphans and feeding them or caring for them and smiling at them, playing with them. So they have an image in their mind, right? So it's very real for them. But for most people, that's absolutely abstract. It's meaningless. In fact, you're not making a connection to your child. So in the end, there has to be something more than that. It has to be about, ultimately, it's not about them wasting food or not eating good food. It's about, you need to trust me. Mommy does not want to hurt you. I am not giving you that Brussels sprout to eat because I really hate, and I really want you to suffer while you're eating. I promise you, if you eat this, you will enjoy the life that you have. But you need to trust me, and whatever it might be. I also think there's a place to say, well, I'm not saying as a bride, but if that's the only thing they're eating and they're always miserable, that's something you need to think about. But knowing all of you, I know that's probably not most of your families. So most of the kids in our lives, they're being treated well, really well. So for them to eat Brussels sprouts every once in a while is not a bad thing.
That's Bella's favorite food. He loves Brussels sprouts.
I've noticed that, like, if I eat the food, he'll always want to grab the food off my plate.
Yeah.
It's like,
Better off your plate.
yeah.
It won't always be like that.
Even if it's the same thing, he'll want to eat it.
You would hope that would be like that, but it might not always be like that. But I will say this is that adults who are really finicky and picky, it's probably because their parents yielded at a very young age. I think you could almost see that across the board. I mean, generally, palates, we have different unique palates, but we could eat anything, really. There were so many things I didn't like growing up. My palates have changed. The things that I enjoyed have definitely changed as I've aged, right?
Yep.
Isn't that true with all of you? There's some things you probably hated as a kid.
I feel like there's a certain age where you can kind of like talk to them and reason with them, so they understand that.
Mm-hmm.
Like Bella, I can kind of talk her through whatever issues she's having with eating her meal. But Maddie, on the other hand, you can't. I don't know. She just screams,
Yes.
and then you can't. And then she like tries to flip herself off
Yep,
the chair.
the salmon breach.
Yeah.
That's what I call it, the
It's like,
salmon breach.
At that,
The
yeah,
stiff
at that
back.
she's like, I couldn't even her. Whereas with Bella, I can,
Yeah.
talk her through it. And
That salmon breach, by the way, I mean, think about how early that starts. And that is absolutely it actually shows their heart. And that action shows they understand. They don't like it. They don't want you to tell them what to do. I'm going to do whatever I want to do. Here goes my salmon breach. It just happens. I mean, it's part of children. That's where they're at. So, for all of you who have young children, I'm sorry, it is hard. I mean, it is tiring. It is taxing. It's emotionally draining. I would say for a single mom, how much more difficult? Because they're working and they're parenting. So there's always the saying that single motherhood is the most demanding job in the whole world. But for those of you, all of you, at least in this room, you're not single mothers or fathers, so you can really do this together. That's where you should be able to receive some sense of strength and some sense of relief, because it is tiring. Maybe on a particular day, and this has definitely happened, where I was more in a better place to actually enforce certain things than Zula was, because she was with the kids the whole day. She had to deal with this, and so therefore when I came home, I'm coming in all happy-go-lucky and, oh, how is it? And she's had a really hard day, and I don't understand that. And so I need to be first gracious to her, understand where she's been at, understand that her job is very difficult, because she stayed at home. Not everyone does this, but she did, and I had a hard time staying at home with my kids. It's really difficult. If for any of you who work regularly, whether you're a man or a woman, try staying at home with your kids a lot. It's hard when they're young. It is hard. I'd rather go back and do whatever I have to do. But recognize that that's there, and maybe I need to take over discipline on that day, or enforcing certain things, because the other person is sort of up to here. So seeing some signs that you're in it together, and that's okay. Okay? Any other thoughts?
I have a question about that. As far as parenting together, I mean, I know that we had conflicts in the past where, if he's disciplining the kids, he wants me to be right there by his side and saying, yeah, you do what Daddy said. I just did that all day. I'm so done with that. Like, I'm not telling you to referee, sorry, but there is like moments when you do need to parent together, and moments when you don't feel like parenting together.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think that's, part of the battle of
Yeah.
consistency. And
When I say parenting together, I don't mean literally where you're doing everything together at the same time. What I mean is that you've had, like, a lot of this is backroom discussions. In other words, it's sort of like a football game. You have a huddle. The huddle is together. You have a plan of attack, and then you go out, and each part of the football team has a role to actually bring about success. So the huddling is, you have to be agreement as to how you're going to implement all of these things that are hopefully going to lead that child to a place where they really understand what you're doing and why you're doing it as a couple, right? So the more you're together on it, the more, if something happens, you're not unintentionally undermining each other, because that can happen. One parent says something and the other parent's thinking, wait a second, I totally don't agree with what you just said, towards that child. And when your child sees that, they get confused, because in their mind they see both of you, hopefully to some extent, equally in terms of authority. And once you're colliding in authority visibly in front of them, they have no idea how to respond to that, right? And they don't know which one is right or wrong. So it becomes incredibly confusing. So what you need to do is, before you even do anything, you should be thinking, okay, when we have, let's say, the mealtime, when there's a mealtime challenge, what are we going to do? How are we going to approach it? What happens? Or maybe if one of you is extremely tired, Victor's had a long day of work, he really can't handle it, Julia, how are you going to step in? Or vice versa, what is that going to look like? So when you come to that situation, you already have a plan of attack. But I would say this, though, is that there's never been, I don't think I can ever recall an instance where Sue and I both together disciplined a child together in the same room. One thing that I would say, and again, we'll talk a lot. I'm sorry I'm not talking about it this week. I said I figured, he's going to talk about the rod next week. But I will say this, though, is that this is just, I don't think there's anything in the Bible that says this is exactly how it should be done, but I feel like there's some practical wisdom in this, is that I never discipline my children in any public space with anybody else except for me and that child. And the reason is because, one, physical discipline is not meant to be any child. And there is something that child could experience if there was any type of physical discipline with somebody else there, including each other. This has got to me, this was a conversation between the Lord, that child, and me. And it's one in which I want this child to know that they're not receiving physical discipline, corporal discipline, because I want them to be embarrassed by what they've done and therefore guilt them into feeling a change of heart. It just doesn't happen that way. No one ever comes to the Lord because they feel so embarrassed. They usually come because they're under conviction of sin. It's a different type of guilt. And so I want that child to know that I love them. I don't want to lose my cool. If I'm angry, I won't discipline that child. Then we have to switch off, or we have to think about another way. In the moment, or sometimes there's delay. That has its own challenges too, because too long of a delay, a child doesn't always connect action to response if the distance is long, time distance, especially the younger they are. Does that make sense? You probably see that. The younger they are, the more you distance and separate your discipline, the less they understand why they're being disciplined. Because they just don't process it like that. So they almost need, that's why when I said I had to leave the restaurant to go to my home, because I couldn't say, all right, let's wait till you get back. He was too young for that. He didn't, if I did that, he would not have understood why he was being disciplined, which would have defeated the purpose of discipline in the first place, which is never about punishment, but understanding what he had done, not just against me, but ultimately against the Lord, and why it can't be that way. So recognizing that is so important. And I also think that there is something to the uniqueness of recognizing that I'm having this one-on-one conversation with this child. It's really important for me to look this person in the eye without that child appealing to somebody else, which you mentioned earlier, Julia. Children are very because they're like us, we're blame shifters and natural autonomous sinners who wants to deflect blame as much as possible. That child would, if Sue and I went into a conversation to a place of discipline with that child would probably appeal to one of us to try to turn one of us against each other. Not necessarily intentionally, but by appealing to maybe the softer person. They will either intentionally or unintentionally manipulate the situation to try to lessen the consequence of their action. And that has a problem, a serious problem too. So that's why I would say one-on-one discipline, it has a real basis of strength in a way and positive results.
Can I ask also about, since you're
Does
talking
that answer your
about,
question though?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Can I ask about, like, you know, when you are doing the, you know, I guess the corporal discipline, you know, because we talked about not using God as the disciplining rod. So when do you bring God in the picture when you're in that moment? Do you bring it up later, or is it part of that conversation?
Yeah. Okay. How much time? Because I was gonna say, all right, I'll just talk about corporal discipline now. Maybe I'll just whet your appetite and then.
To be continued.
Yeah, and then to be continued. Is that when? So let's take, for example, these instances of the food issue, right? If I do it well, this is how it works, is that I will say, Jack, we're going to need to go have a conversation, and, you know, and there's going to be some consequences to your, I won't say usually your misbehavior, because it's not the behavior, but consequences to your heart that is opposing both Mommy and I. It's not Jack, it's, let's say, Carissa, because she actually did this many times. And I would say between, Carissa was almost as strong-willed and as hard-hearted as Jack was. If you look at her today, she doesn't seem like that at all. But she was totally like that. And she's today the more creative. This is where I know there's no stifling of anything because of discipline. I mean, by far, out of all of our kids, she's the most artistic, creative. Yeah, there are some challenges with her. We've had to talk through a lot of things, but I really do believe she knows the Lord. She's tenderhearted. She really feels guilt over wrong when she sins against God. But I think that if we didn't do what we did early on, not that we did that, the Lord used us as a means, but I do think that when I remember what she was like as a child, she was so rebellious. She was very, very rebellious many, many times as a child, as a really little child. But she was also the most happy-go-lucky and excitable. So it was a real contrast. Well, anyway, let's say I'm going to use Carissa as an example because I don't want to always use Jack. But I would say, Carissa, you're going to need to, we need to go have a talk, and there's got to be consequences to what's going on with your heart and your opposition to Mommy, whatever. So whatever I would say. So usually I brought her into the bathroom, or either the bathroom or like a room or something. And I would first ask her some questions. Do you know what you did wrong? Do you know why we're here? Sort of similar questions to what Paul Tripp asked. And then she would usually say, oh, that's because I didn't, whatever it was. I said I don't like you or whatever. I don't want to eat this food, or I threw it down to the ground and I stomped on it, whatever it was, And I would say, well, that's not just, that's something that hurts Mommy and me because Mommy made that food. She worked hard at it. So I'd explain it, why there's something wrong about that. They need to understand the why to the best that you possibly can in their language, to their ability. And then I would say, no, that's right. But we also need to recognize that whenever there's something wrong, there's always going to be a consequence. There's going to be something that happens because wrong things always need to have a result. There needs to be something to change because this is going to help change your heart. And sometimes it would be like this, where they're just screaming and yelling, throwing a tantrum. And I would if bring her in, and then I would say that. And usually, again, this is not written in the Bible or anything like that, but I do think actually it is written in the Bible. The Bible talks about using the rod, and I think there's some wisdom in using an instrument versus your hand. There's a couple of reasons why. Anyone know what the reasons are?
You want to associate the negativity with the object.
Okay, so that's one.
And then I just thought that I had heard some that my hand was used to as a source of love and not as a punishment.
Yeah, yeah, that's sort of, the second one, that is similar, so that's one of the main reasons. But the second one is more practical, and it's this, with a rod, and for me, sometimes I use the chopstick. You're probably thinking, chopstick?
I used the chopstick too when I was little.
Yeah. Or a very thin, something thin, because my hand, what's interesting about the hand is that sometimes I would have to hit. And I rarely hit with my hand, but if I hit them with my hand, they just never felt pain. And you know what would happen is that I'd have to hit them harder. Because if they're laughing while you're doing it, you basically taught them that what they've done is a joke, or it's not that serious. It should be enough that they actually feel pain, that they cry. Because if they don't, and sometimes with my kids, especially the stronger little ones, they would try hard not to cry. Because in their mind, in their heart, they're thinking, I refuse to yield to you, even at that point. And so I usually told them up front, and dependent on what the infraction was, I would tell them how many strikes they're going to get. For a small one, it would be 3. But for something major, it could be 5, anywhere from 5 to 10. Mm-hmm. And I would use like a little stick, like I said, a chopstick, or not a gigantic one, like paddle, but I would use like the wooden spoon, but at the end of it. And I would only hit them on the rear. I would actually make them pull down their pants, and I would hit them on the rear. And because it's the fleshiest part of their body. Not their leg, not their face, obviously. That was a never, and I never, ever, ever hit any of my kids in their face. Any of you ever been hit in the face before? Yeah, I know. It's a terrible thing, especially by a parent. You never want to hit your children in the face. You don't want to hit them anywhere except, I think, to my kids, they knew that corporal discipline, it's going to hurt, but it's not going to create any lasting pain or terrible memories. Like if you talk to them today, they're not thinking, I feel terrible, I'm scarred for life. They're not. And I give you full license. I mean, Derek, Gloria, you always look at them because they're babysitting. You go ask them.
We always do every Tuesday night. Tell us what your dad.
So you go ask them, do you feel like that has made you more angry today? Seriously. Because when we did those things, we did all that we could. I'm not saying that we did it perfectly. There were times I had to confess my own sin and apologize to them. But most of the times we were in control. And then after that, I would tell them, you know what? Again, this is not just rebellion against me. It's also rebellion against God. And I have a responsibility. So it's not God told me to hit you. But it's this is me. I'm doing it. But I also know that God has this over me as well, that I need to submit. I am willing to receive this type of discipline and consequence for my actions, because I don't want to turn away from Him. That's Hebrews chapter 12, right? Verses 4 through 12. The very passage was preached from not that long ago. And then after that, they're usually crying, both their pants, and then I say, I put them in my lap and I say, I want you to know that I love you. I will always love you. I care for you. I did this not because I'm mad at you or because I want to hit you or anything like that. I did it because I want to show you that there's a better way. and that your heart is naturally turned away from us and God, and this is to remind you that we love you this much that we want to bring you back to us. And then I would pray with them, and then I would say, let's go have fun. And they would literally run out the door laughing. I know that's hard to imagine, but it's true. I mean, I don't know if you've had that experience, but they would literally go running out the door. Sometimes they were throwing tantrums and totally, and it's almost as if they're like, oh, please give me corporal discipline so I can finally have fun again. Because they're just going nuts sometimes, and there's no other recourse. I'm not saying it's always like that, but there were times where it was like that, and it is startling, actually, to see the change. Literally, a timeout didn't do that sometimes. There is a place for timeouts, actually. I do think sometimes, like for Jack, actually, he had a harder time sometimes with timeouts more than with corporal discipline because he just had a strong will about it. It was almost like, go ahead, Amy, I don't care, I'm going to bear it. You can't. But he hated being alone. Being alone was almost terrorizing to him. So he would almost rather have corporal discipline than to have a timeout. It's interesting in that way. We usually mix both with him more. So like I said, every child's a little different. You have to assess what it's like, but don't relinquish the rod, which has a real place for the child that's young. We rarely physically discipline our kids. I think the only one we've done that to of late has been Jack every once in a while, but even with him, it's very rare. It's something that happens once every 2 months or something. And even that will probably be even lesser. So, I mean, he's 8 years old. He's 9 years old, just turned 9, and now we're almost completely done with that. And he still has his challenges here and there, but generally, he's very different than how he used to be. He's grown a lot. So that's sort of what I would say. That's the picture. And I want them to show that God is a loving God, and this is an opportunity to come together, to enjoy life together, and to experience God's grace in their lives. And I mean, that's the picture that I don't know what he's going to say, actually, because I haven't watched the next one, but I think it's going to be something similar. Any thoughts or questions? No? No? Let me just say one last thing, and then, which is the different ways to obey without challenge, without excuse, without delay. Your kids are going to challenge you quite often at the young ages. 0 to 5, they will challenge you almost regularly, and sometimes it could be multiple times in a day. So you have to be ready for that. You have to know that that's going to happen. The more you're aware of that, you can sort of prep yourself, rather than being. And also, I always think of it this way: I'm not surprised by sin. The more you are in the lives of people, the more you see the realities of sin. And it's not just that, it's my own heart. I see it in myself. So I don't think you should be shocked that your child does something that you say, where did you get that from? How did you know? They're naturally going to do that. They're naturally going to challenge you. So take these as opportunities rather than as wearisome moments. And if you think that way, it'll really be an opportunity for you to really lead your child back to Christ. And the second is, I thought he had a real wisdom about without excuse. I didn't hear you, I forgot. Yet you say, I promise you a trip to Disneyland. You say it a year in advance. They will remember that like no tomorrow. They'll never forget it. But something that you say that you want them to do, because they will say, I forgot. It just don't let them get away with it. And excuses are more about, and when you let them get away with it, it's more about your unwillingness to deal with it than it is about them, doing it or not doing it. So be aware that since the garden, people have been making excuses. You do it, I do it, we all do it. Why wouldn't our kids do it? And they're pretty good at it too. The other thing that he talked about is without delay. Something that I really, really want to urge you to do all that you can, the best that you can, not to allow delay of obedience. In other words, don't count down. Come over here. I'm gonna give you 3 seconds to obey. 3, 2, 1. And then they finally do it. Because what you're doing is you're allowing them, but when you think about what you're really doing, you're saying, you don't have to obey me except after the 3 seconds. I mean, that's the only message you're giving them. And so, how many children, most children, if you give them 3 seconds or 10 seconds, they're just going to take it. They're always going to take it. They're always going to think, I have 3 seconds to really follow you. I don't have to obey you and your word. I just have to obey the time period that you're giving. And so remember, the whole point is you're trying to shape the heart, not behavior. You're not trying to get them to do something. You're trying to recognize that, okay, when they're not coming at my original word, what they're saying is, your word is not that important to me because what I'm doing is more important than what you're saying. And so you wouldn't do that. If a child is sitting in the middle of a street and it's on rushing cars, you wouldn't say, I want you to get out of the street. 3 seconds. 1, you wouldn't do that because you know that child's life is on the line, and a delayed obedience is not obedience at all. So really what you need to do is and it might take training. All of this is, everything that we're talking about, you might think, oh boy, but I've been parenting this way for so long. It's not too late. And again, I think for Ellen and I, we have kids who are teens, right? But even for us, it's not too late. And I have some of those who are watching, you're parenting teens, and I know some of you are really struggling with parenting teens. And you're probably thinking, boy, I wish I would have done that as a child when they were really young. But I think what you need to recognize is that it's not too late because you're still shaping the heart. Try to do all that you can. Extend mercy and grace. Teach. But you, at the young age, have a lot less to climb over as impediments. Is that not true, Ellen?
Yeah. I think when you do it younger, you're just kind of sort of laying this foundation, and as they get older, you're just building on it.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you start doing it at 10, that's when you have to start laying foundation, and that's really
It's really hard.
So, I mean, I definitely noticed that it was challenging because I have 2 very strong-willed boys. They take after their mom, and very rebellious and very, challenging authority all the time. So I had to really, be, I guess, strict is the word. And so I used to get criticism all the time. You worried about, are people going to think I'm too, authoritative or all this stuff. But so I had to lay really strong boundaries. But within those boundaries, they had a lot of freedom if they obeyed, right? But so I was just thinking about what you're saying about, without challenge, without excuse, without delay. I had to deal with all of these, and I still do it to some extent. But it's thinking if I hadn't done a lot of the things that I had to do, which was really hard, and most of the time I didn't do it right, but that it is easier now. If I had to do that with, I think, gosh, if I had to do something like this, and I hadn't done that and have to do this all over again, it would be, I just couldn't do it.
It would be
out of control.
So you see parents of teens where they're literally dealing with this stuff at teen years. Think about it. When you think about rebellion happens all throughout our lives. It's not something that you pick up in the teen years. A lot of people think, oh, those rebellious teen years, they're the most miserable years. Well, usually it's because they didn't deal with it when they were 5. So now it's full born when they're 15. And I'm not saying, with Carissa, who's now turning 15, we had to have some serious talks. There were some breaches of trust. We had to deal with that and work through it. I saw her, a girl who wanted to experience certain freedoms, to now a person who says, I don't need that, I don't want that. It was amazing, actually. It was from her. And that was pretty, even though there were certain things she really failed us in, or failed the Lord ultimately in. She came to see that for herself. And I do believe that a lot of it flows from not our parenting, but more of God's word that gave us insight as to how we can shepherd our children to lead them to want to follow God and to recognize when they do sin that it's wrong and it's change. So it's never to say let's parent so that they don't make mistakes and they don't sin against God. They will. All do. So we can't raise perfect moral creatures. But what we're trying to raise are people who say, I need Jesus. I see my sin. I need a Savior. That's where we're always pointing them towards. And that's biblical parenting, is not to raise morally good children, but it's to raise children who actually say, I really need Jesus in my life. So I hope you see that. Next week we'll really flesh out more of the discipline stuff and go more into detail. Any other last questions before we go?
Okay, good. And so in talking about, just instilling that redemptive story to our kids, how do you keep it fresh, especially if you're doing it now when they're young? Just recently, like, I was counseling someone because they had marital conflict, and Arden was in the room. He heard a lot of it, and he asked. He was just like, why were they fighting? And I was just like, well, Arden, we all fight. It's part of relationships and marriage. He was just like you and Daddy. I was just like, exactly. And he was just like, that's why. And he's like, yeah, because we all sin. I was like, exactly. And he was like, and that's why we need Jesus. I'm like, yes. And an epilogue about exactly, Arden, this is exactly why we need Jesus, because we all sin, we all fail each other, and we all argue, and it's just our nature. And he cut me in the middle of my epilogue, and he was just like, Mommy. He's like, I've already heard it. He was like, Arden has had enough. And that was, he was like, he was like, I already heard this a bunch of times. I don't need to. You don't need to go through it all anymore.
Challenging you.
So how do you keep it? Especially you have these things about pastors' kids growing up and going the other way, because if they've heard it for so much and so long.
Yes. I feel like, and I don't know if Ellen maybe you've done this, but for my kids, and like I said, Sue and I went through a point of a little bit of rebellion with Carissa, with some deception, and as we were walking through it, we came to see that we were trying to parent her in a certain way, but at a certain point, there's a lot of, okay, Lord, this is going to be sort of a make or break time, because either it's going to be rote memory stuff that's not going to affect her heart, it's just going to be stuff that she always did, so I have to be, and definitely she felt, I think we had to go back and have some signification with her about your standard is no different than any other kid in our church, your moral standard. And in fact, you probably will never reach any type of moral ability to follow God. But definitely it's nerve-wracking. It's intense at that point, because you're always praying and thinking, what happens if she doesn't get it? What happens if it's just rote memory stuff and she's just spouting out Bible verses in the gospel message? But what's amazing is that the one thing that she got was she saw her sin herself. It wasn't something that I had to point out to her. She did it, but then she saw it herself, what she became. And she realized she didn't want to be that person. She was at a crossroad. The crossroad, we've all come to that crossroad, where you say, I need Jesus. I'm either going here, I'm going to trust the Lord. And I don't think all those times of sharing that gospel, knowing those thoughts, were empty. Even though it's not fresh, the amazing thing is you cannot make it fresh. You can only say it over and over again. And there you trust the Holy Spirit to make it fresh. He's the one who does it. So Julia, here's what God does for you. He doesn't give you the responsibility of salvation. He's not gonna, you cannot save Arden. And you can't make the gospel so delectable and delightful that he's gonna say, Mom, you convinced me. I really want to believe in Jesus. I'm such a terrible sinner. I need Christ. I want to live my life for him. There's nothing you will say in presenting the gospel that will make him want that. And that frees you from ever taking responsibility or ownership of that. Instead, what God wants of you is to just keep on doing it. Do what you're doing. Do what you're doing, Vic. Do what you all do. Share the gospel. trust God with the results. And so somewhere along willing, with providence, that child's going to see that they need a savior. Does that help you? To me, that's freeing, you know, or else I would feel so responsible for my children's salvation. And that would be miserable. I'll never be able to save them. I can't. I can only do what I can do. I can bring them to the water, but I cannot make them drink the water. They need to do that themselves. So I really believe that. I think all we're doing is showing them how good it is, but we can't force them to do anything. And anyone who tries to force them, you're going to see terrible, you're going to have bad consequences. That's called legalism, shaming, guilt righteousness, works-based righteousness. That just makes, who would want to follow a system of rules and regulations and moral codes and behaviors that you always feel miserable, that you fail in every time? That's not Christianity. That's a religion of misery. So just preach the gospel, show love and grace, and care for them. Okay, let me pray for us. Father, we know that as your word reminds us over and over again, that this is not our work. And it's a challenge for us because we are prone to feel as though we want to control. We want to save, but we know that there is only one who can. And his name is Jesus, and his work by your Holy Spirit will lead our children to yourself. Instead, what you ask of us is to trust your word in shepherding our children, to at least be in a place where they see a picture of Christ. And you'll do the rest. Pray that you would give my brothers and sisters and dear friends, you would give them boldness, perseverance. When they're weary and tired, that you would help them not to give up, not to surrender their authority and their rights, because by doing so, they give a dim picture of you. But instead, as they shepherd, lead, and work tirelessly to really show their children Jesus, that in doing so, that we pray that the result would be that our kids, by your grace, would come to see that they need a Savior. And your Son is. So I thank you for all these men and women out here. We want to worship you, delight in you. And ask and pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. Thanks, everybody. Stop the broadcast. Well, there's a lot of that.
Sometimes. Yeah, I mean, that's why I guess you want to